if you're anything like me, then you've heard your friends, your neighbor, even the freaking Pope, everyone has been talking about the 2025 LA riots. And I do have to specify 2025 because, well, LA has, let's just say LA has a history. But before we can actually begin here, friends, there is a lot of volatility around this topic and lots of misinformation. My goal here is to actually kind of cut through all of that. I want to get to the facts so that we can get a baseline of what exactly is going on here and how we got here. After that, you can make your own decision about what should or shouldn't be done about it. That's not my job. If you want to just have some pundit tell you what to think, there's lots of channels for that. That is not the point of this channel. So with that out of the way, let's kind of talk about this riot, because the fact of the matter is that LA has a history of protests, riots, but this particular event seems to have been triggered by something that's a little more on the complicated side. You see, the 2025 Los Angeles riots started on June 6th as a response to several ICE raids this past Friday. These raids resulted in a dramatic escalation in the number of deportations that were actually taking place. We're up to 44 people in a single day. And the scenes of these raids were pretty dramatic. According to ABC News, a crowd at a clothing warehouse physically blocked ICE officers from leaving after the officers had conducted a raid. This resulted in flashbangs and other non-lethal tools to be used by the officers to disperse the crowd so that they could make their arrests. These protests then escalated over the weekend into a series of car fires, rubber bullets, standoffs with the police that you see all over social media today, before finally seeming to sort of calm down on Monday, temporarily anyway. Who knows what's coming this weekend? This weekend might bring potentially even more. But if you want to begin to understand more about why the protests have actually taken place, the reason for the protests, my friends, is because these ICE raids over the weekend are not an isolated occurrence. ICE raids in Los Angeles have been increasing dramatically since the start of 2025. Now, if we actually look at what it is that the numbers are on this, according to the deportation statistics maps that can be found on the ICE website, you can go look at these right now if you want to. LA has had, as of the uploading of this video, a total of 1,065 arrests in 2025, with 838 removals also occurring in that time, which, as far as I can tell, just means deportations, which might not actually sound like that much, right? Since LA has, as of 2020, an estimated undocumented immigrant population of almost 1 million people, 900,000 people, which, to put it in perspective, is almost 10% of the population of Los Angeles County. But keep in mind that LA is a sanctuary city, which means that the city doesn't exactly take an active approach in trying to remove illegal immigrants. And to me, it's understandable why. If 10% of the population of the second biggest city in the US got deported, I would think that would, at the very least, cause some intense temporary economic instability, which is probably a bad thing. The long-term impacts are less clear. Some studies suggest that illegal immigrants are a net drain on the US economy and actually take more than they give. Other studies seem to dispute that, and there is quite a bit of debate about this in the economic spheres today. I am not qualified to talk about that. I won't be unpacking that particular can of worms, but suffice to say the economic impact of undocumented immigrants is complicated and probably varies state by state and locality by locality. But with all that being said, ladies and gentlemen, LA has taken more of a laissez-faire or sort of a live and let live approach to immigration, specifically illegal immigration, opting to instead focus more on punishing undocumented immigrants who have actually been convicted of crimes rather than all undocumented immigrants. Which brings us back again, friends, to the numbers. Because like I said before, LA has had a total of 1,065 arrests in 2025, alongside 838 removals. And this is according to the ICE website. Of the people arrested by immigration officials in Los Angeles, about 2/3 of them had criminal convictions, and 34.3%, or just over a third, actually had no convictions or pending charges, but were those who had, quote, broken U.S. immigration laws, including visa overstays and visa waiver program violators. And of the people who were deported in LA, about 17.6% of those were in that same boat of having had no convictions or pending charges against them. Now, compare that to the national statistics. During that same time period, there have been 71,405 removals nationwide during 2025, with a much more significant 67% of those being deported falling into the no convictions or criminal charges category. Now, remember, that's compared to only 17.6% in LA, which means that if you are an undocumented immigrant in LA, you have been thus far in 2025 fairly safe from being deported relative to the rest of the country, at least, as long as you've not been convicted of other criminal charges. You know, if you're keeping your nose clean, just doing your work, LA is a pretty safe place to be. And this is probably because, again, LA is what's known as a sanctuary city, meaning that the local city and state officials actually share less immigration information with ICE. Now, this is a bit of a sidebar or a tangent, if you will, but I feel that I should actually explain what a sanctuary city is, because there are some incorrect notions out there. So try to stick with me, because I know this gets a little complicated, and honestly, it probably deserves a video in itself. But to make a long story short, a sanctuary city doesn't mean that illegal immigrants never get deported. It means that the state retains more of that control over who gets deported and shares less of that information with ICE, making it more difficult for ICE to make arrests. According to globalrefuge.org, sanctuary policies do not mean that local law enforcement conceals or shelters undocumented immigrants from detection by federal authorities, nor does it mean that local law enforcement protects undocumented immigrants from deportation or prosecution for criminal activities. State and local police still enforce state and local criminal laws against immigrants who are accused of committing a crime in sanctuary jurisdictions. What does all that mean? Well, that means that the state government still can punish undocumented immigrants that are actually committing crimes, up to and including potentially even deporting them, but it just won't actively seek out to punish or deport undocumented immigrants that are not committing other crimes. So now that we kind of understand a little better what a sanctuary city is, and we have sort of a recent background of the immigration situation in Los Angeles, we can finally circle back to the topic of this video, the protests. And keeping in mind what I'm about to say, I want to thank ABC for putting together a helpful timeline of events that has been useful in my research. And if you want any specifics, by the way, on where any of my information is coming from, you will find all of the appropriate links in the video description for that. But the bottom line, friends, is that ICE has been ramping up deportations in the last few days in Los Angeles, a city that doesn't want its significant undocumented immigrant population threatened by mass deportation. And so, after 44 people were arrested in a single day of raids on June 6th, protests started to break out. Crowds tried to stop ICE arrests from taking place, as arrests were made at several workplaces in the city, and ultimately, those crowds began gathering outside of a federal detention center in Los Angeles. And this was apparently where lawyers had said that those who were arrested had been taken. Now, these events only escalated over the next couple of days, with Saturday and Sunday thus far having marked the most dramatic days of the protests. And while it does appear that most of the protesters are relatively peaceful, there have been instances of more violent activities actually taking place, with protesters damaging police and National Guard property and lighting numbers of unmanned vehicles on fire. There have also been reports of businesses being looted, particularly as protests have continued into this week. As far as I can tell, most of the protests over the weekend were predominantly peaceful, actually, while opportunists, we could call them, are beginning to take advantage of the situation and of the chaos to steal and vandalize what appears to be relatively large numbers, perhaps dozens, of local downtown businesses. This has actually led to a curfew being put into place this week, which seems to be helping calm things down, for the time being, at least. Some police officers have had rocks thrown at them, and police have resorted in at least a couple of instances to using tear gas and rubber bullets, as well as other non-lethal types of munitions to control the crowds, causing minor injuries among some of the protesters. As of the writing of this script, I have been unable to find any reports of more serious injuries or fatalities among the protesters or law enforcement personnel. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we are reaching the point where Trump actually called for the National Guard to show up. And this was in direct defiance to California Governor Gavin Newsom, who thought that the National Guard's presence was not only unnecessary, but would probably actually further inflame tensions and potentially lead to more violent action by protesters, not less. And now this is significant because it marks the first time the National Guard has actually been activated without the request of a state's governor since 1965. And whether or not Trump actually has the authority to do that in this situation is a big question legally at the moment. And the California governor actually filed a lawsuit against the Trump administration on that very point. So it will kind of remain to be seen what happens with that. But the fact of the matter remains, ladies and gentlemen, that whether the National Guard are legally supposed to be there or not, 2,000 California National Guard troops began deploying in defense of federal buildings on Sunday, and more particularly in defense of ICE officers as they continued their raids on undocumented immigrants in the Los Angeles area. And while it's difficult to say if that is why, it does seem to be the case that most of the looting actually didn't start until after the National Guard arrived in Los Angeles. So it certainly is at least possible that the National Guard presence has increasingly agitated the protesters. The earliest reports that I've seen of burning cars and looting were from activities that didn't start until Sunday, which is when the National Guard troops actually began to arrive. But the question you might be asking yourselves, friends, is the question that I was asking myself learning about all this for the first time, which was, how bad is it? Really? How many protesters are out there? How many people are rioting? And it's a bit hard to tell exactly. It will probably take several more days or even weeks until more accurate data starts coming up around this. But as best as I can tell, the protests have thus far been relatively small. We're talking a few city blocks, maybe 5, several isolated downtown Los Angeles streets. But for the most part, most of LA, most of the streets and businesses have been more or less functioning as usual. The numbers of protesters have definitely been at least in the thousands. I would guess that it probably didn't reach the tens of thousands. And for the most part, if you're talking about injuries to property, officers, protesters, or acts of violent crime, you're looking at maybe a few dozen instances of those types of things happening, which is not good, of course. Violence is always a bad thing. But as far as riots go, well, if you're going to call this a riot, so far it's been a pretty tame riot. This has been not that bad compared, contrast it with the 90s LA riots where 60 people died. It's not really comparable to that yet, even though some people have been doing that. Now, that being said, I do want to draw attention to some of the more dramatic aspects of these events, because it is true that there have been instances of escalations of violence on both sides, with disturbing videos of LAPD shooting rubber bullets at reporters, sometimes for no discernible reason, and protesters saying and doing some pretty unhinged things. One protester was even arrested for assault with a deadly weapon. Now, my friends, as the protests began to become more unruly over the weekend, the Los Angeles mayor, Karen Bass, actually went ahead and implemented a curfew covering 1 square mile and 100,000 of Los Angeles's residents on Tuesday, which, as of the recording of this video, Wednesday, is still in effect, restricting who can actually be out and about on the streets of Los Angeles. But so far, for the actual scope of what's happening, over Saturday, Sunday, and Monday, you're looking at a total of about 140 arrests that had actually been made, with the vast majority being for failure to disperse, and only a few being for things like resisting arrest, vandalism, or assault. And now add in Tuesday, and even more arrests have come in, about an additional 200, mostly for non-violent activities, like blocking a public roadway or violating curfew. But there have surely been many protesters who have looted buildings or thrown rocks who have not been caught and arrested for it. And like I said, about 1 square mile of the city is still under this curfew. So clearly there is still a little bit of a problem that is going on here. Where we are now, though, is that these protests are beginning to spread cross country, with cities like Chicago, New York, Austin, and dozens more either having protests earlier this week or facing future protests this weekend or after, in solidarity with the anti-ICE Los Angeles protesters. And so whether you agree with the protesters or not, they seem to have inspired a nationwide movement, at least for now. Bottom line is, my friends, it's going to get interesting over the next few days to weeks. If you live in a major city in the US, well, maybe leave for work a little bit early for a while, because your roadway might just end up blocked by protesters.